Welcome back, Wasteland Wanderers. Today, I'm bringing you a confession that's been sealed in golden tombs and buried beneath Nevada salt mines for over 2 centuries. This is the story of Vault 88 and the Mummified Ones Vault-Tec's attempt to combine ancient preservation with modern horrors. What they created wasn't immortality, it was something far worse. Let's descend into the tomb and uncover the truth about Project Eternal Pharaoh. The golden sarcophagus was supposed to keep me safe, preserved in perfect stasis while the world ended, but when I finally woke up, I couldn't remember my name, only the hunger. Vault-Tec called it Project Eternal Pharaoh, combining cryogenic technology with radiation-absorbing wrappings and ancient preservation techniques to create immortal survivors. What they created instead were us. Every morning I unwrap another piece of the treated linen from my arms, watching dead skin slough away beneath it, wondering if I'm still human or if I died in that vault 200 years ago and just forgot to stop moving. I don't remember my real name anymore. The terminal outside my sarcophagus says I was Subject 0847, Protocol Kepri, but that means nothing to the thing I've become. Names are for the living, and I'm not sure which side of that line I stand on anymore. My hands look like they belong to someone else, something else, wrapped in yellowing linen that's fused to flesh that shouldn't still be moving. When I press my fingers together, I can feel the fabric shifting beneath skin that feels more like leather than anything human. The texture is all wrong, too dry, too tight, like a mask that doesn't quite fit the face underneath. The last clear memory I have is October 22nd, 2077. I can still see the Vault-Tec representative's smile, perfectly white teeth gleaming under fluorescent lights as I signed the waiver. Premium Preservation Program, they called it. Revolutionary technology combining ancient Egyptian wisdom with modern science. I remember thinking how clever it sounded, how sophisticated. They showed us promotional materials, glossy brochures with images of golden tombs and promises of perfect preservation. We would sleep through the apocalypse and wake up when the world was safe again, unchanged, untouched by time or radiation. 500 of us signed up, paid our life savings for the privilege. We were told we were investing in immortality itself. The demonstration vault they showed us looked like something out of a museum exhibition. Golden sarcophagi lined up in perfect rows, each one gleaming under carefully positioned lights. They told us the alloy was gold titanium, nearly indestructible, radiation-proof. The interior was lined with advanced cryogenic systems, temperature sensors, atmospheric controls. Every sarcophagus was a self-contained preservation unit, capable of maintaining perfect conditions for centuries. The scientists explained how the wrappings worked, layers of specially treated cloth soaked in a proprietary compound they called Osiris, Radaway, Rad-X, and something else they wouldn't specify. Trade secrets, they said, cutting-edge technology meets ancient tradition. I remember the day they wrapped me. It took hours, methodical and ceremonial. They had us lie down on preparation tables while technicians wound the cloth around our bodies, starting at the feet and working upward. The fabric was cold and wet, heavy with chemicals. The smell was overwhelming, sharp and medicinal with an undertone of something organic that made my stomach turn. They covered everything, leaving only small openings for tubes and sensors. My face was the last thing they wrapped, and I remember the panic as the cloth covered my eyes, my mouth, my nose. I couldn't breathe for a moment before they inserted the breathing apparatus. The technician's voice was calm, professional. "This is normal," she said. "You'll be asleep in minutes. You won't feel anything." The sarcophagus itself was beautiful in a terrible way. When they sealed me inside, I had one last glimpse of the chamber. Rows and rows of golden tombs, each one identical except for the designation numbers etched into the lids. Mine read, Protocol Kepri, Subject 0847. The interior was lined with soft padding, and I could see the cryogenic coils embedded in the walls, tiny lights blinking in sequence. The lid came down slowly, blocking out the light 1 inch at a time. The last thing I saw was my reflection in the polished gold, a mummy wrapped in treated linen, barely recognizable as human. Vault-Tec sold it as the ultimate survival solution. We would be preserved like the pharaohs of old, but with modern technology ensuring we actually woke up. The marketing materials emphasized the connection to ancient Egypt, how their preservation techniques had kept bodies intact for thousands of years. Combined with cryogenics and radiation shielding, we would emerge from our tombs completely unchanged, mentally and physically intact, ready to rebuild civilization. 500 wealthy pre-war citizens bought into this specific vault experiment. We thought we were the lucky ones, the chosen few who would survive while the world burned. What they didn't tell us was that Vault 88, the official designation, was built in an abandoned salt mine under Nevada. The location was chosen specifically because ancient Egyptian preservation techniques required ideal humidity conditions. The salt mine provided natural desiccation, perfect for mummification. The deeper chambers extended for miles, carved out of rock salt deposits that had been there for millions of years. Vault-Tec's engineers had reinforced the natural caves, added support structures, installed the necessary systems. The entire facility was designed around one principle: create the perfect environment for combining ancient preservation with modern technology. The experiment's goal was deceptively simple. Test if combining cryogenic mummification with radiation-absorbing materials could create survivors who would emerge completely unchanged, mentally and physically intact. The scientists wanted to see if the human body could be preserved not just structurally, but functionally. Could someone sleep for centuries and wake up with all their memories, all their cognitive abilities, all their humanity still intact? The wrappings were supposed to protect against radiation, while the cryogenic systems prevented cellular degradation. The compound Osiris was meant to keep tissues viable even in extreme conditions. On paper, it was brilliant. In practice, it was something else entirely. When I woke up, or whatever you call this state, the first thing I noticed was that my Pip-Boy's clock showed 2,287. 210 years had passed since I closed my eyes in that golden tomb. The second thing I noticed was that I could see through my own eyelids, straight through the wrappings. The linen that should have been opaque was somehow transparent to my vision. Like looking through dirty glass, I could see the interior of the sarcophagus, the frost-covered walls, the condensation dripping from the coils. I could see beyond that, through the golden lid itself, perceiving the chamber outside as if the metal wasn't there at all. The golden lid of my sarcophagus had cracked during a seismic event decades ago. I could see the fracture line running across my field of vision, a jagged split in the metal where something had impacted it with tremendous force. Through that crack, trace radiation had been seeping in for years, maybe decades. It mixed with the compound Osiris in my wrappings, creating a chemical reaction that nobody had predicted. The cryogenic systems kept me frozen while the radiation slowly altered the preservation compounds, transforming them into something new. By the time I woke up, the damage was already done. I just didn't know it yet. My skin felt wrong from the first moment, too tight, too dry, like it belonged to a corpse animated by something that shouldn't exist. When I finally managed to unwrap my hand, pulling away layers of stiffened linen, the flesh underneath was gray, green, and leathery. The texture was all wrong, like badly tanned leather stretched over bone. My fingers moved when I willed them to, but the movements were jerky, uncoordinated. I had to concentrate to make them bend, like learning to use my own body all over again. The nails were thick and yellowed, more like claws than anything human. I stared at that hand for what felt like hours, trying to reconcile it with my memories of what my hands used to look like. The vault's interior had become a catacomb. When I finally broke free from my sarcophagus, tearing through the weakened lid with strength I didn't understand, I found myself in a chamber of horrors. Rows upon rows of golden sarcophagi, stretched into the darkness, most still sealed. Some had burst open from the inside, their lids torn off and thrown aside. Wrappings were scattered across floors that hadn't seen maintenance in centuries, trailing between the tombs like abandoned shrouds. The emergency lighting flickered sporadically, casting moving shadows that made the whole scene look like something out of a nightmare. I wandered through halls lined with hieroglyphic warnings that Vault-Tec had painted there for psychological conditioning of subjects. They'd gone all in on the Egyptian theme, covering every wall with fake hieroglyphs, cartouches, images of ancient gods, Anubis weighing hearts, Osiris presiding over the dead, Ra sailing his solar barge through the underworld. It was meant to reinforce the connection to ancient preservation techniques, make us feel like we were part of something timeless and sacred. Instead, it just made the whole place feel like a tomb, which I suppose is exactly what it was. The overseer's terminal was in a sealed chamber at the vault's center. It took me hours to find it, navigating through corridors I didn't recognize, following emergency signs that were barely legible. The door was locked, but my new strength made short work of it. I tore the handle off and forced the door open, metal screaming as it bent. Inside was a small office, pristine and untouched. The overseer had left everything behind when they evacuated, or died, or whatever happened. The terminal was still active, running on emergency power. The screen glowed green in the darkness. The files revealed everything. I sat there for hours, reading through log after log, watching the truth unfold in neatly typed text. Compound Osiris wasn't just radiation-absorbing chemicals. It contained modified AFib samples mixed with experimental preservatives meant to keep tissues alive indefinitely, even in a toxic environment. The forced evolutionary virus, the same thing that created super mutants and worse. They'd modified it, stabilized it, combined it with preservation compounds and radiation shielding. The theory was that FEV could repair cellular damage faster than radiation could cause it, creating a perfect equilibrium. The subject would be preserved, protected, immortal. The cryo-mummification process was supposed to keep us unconscious for 180 years maximum. The automated systems were programmed to receive a wake-up signal after that period, triggered by environmental sensors monitoring radiation levels outside the vault. When the background radiation dropped below a certain threshold, we would all wake up simultaneously, ready to emerge into a world that was healing. But the automated systems never received the wake-up signal after the bombs fell. The communication arrays were destroyed in the initial strikes. We slept on, frozen, and preserved, while the decades turned into centuries. Some of us woke up too early. I found their sarcophagi empty, lids torn, open or carefully removed. Wrappings trailed across the floor toward the vault exit, dark stains marking their passage, blood or something darker. The early risers had left behind evidence of their confusion, their horror, messages scratched into walls, desperate pleas, incomprehensible symbols. Some had tried to wake others, breaking open sarcophagi to find only corpses inside. The logs mentioned incidents, containment breaches, subjects displaying unexpected behaviors. Then the logs stopped, mid-sentence, as if whoever was writing simply gave up or died. Others never woke at all. Their preservation chambers had malfunctioned, systems failing one by one over the long years. I found them when I opened intact sarcophagi, hoping to find survivors. What I found instead were actual mummies, desiccated corpses in golden tombs, still wearing the pre-war jewelry they'd insisted on keeping. Rings on skeletal fingers, necklaces around collapsed throats, watches on wrist bones. They'd paid for immortality and got death instead, their bodies preserved but lifeless, eternal monuments to Vault-Tec's failed promises. But the worst were the ones like me, the successful subjects who'd been exposed to just enough radiation to activate the FEV in Compound Osiris, transforming us into something between human, ghoul, and super mutant. We could still think that was the horror. We remembered being human, remembered our families, our jobs, our lives before the vault. We could recall every detail of who we used to be, what we used to look like. but our bodies had become something out of ancient nightmares, shambling mockeries of human form wrapped in radioactive linen. The wrappings had fused with our skin in places, becoming part of us. I tried to remove them all once, pulled at the cloth until it tore, revealing the flesh beneath. Where the fabric came away easily, the skin underneath was leathery and dead-looking. Where it resisted, pulling at it meant tearing off chunks of my own flesh. The pain was excruciating, primal, and I stopped trying. I wore them like a burial shroud now, shambling through the vault with strips of treated linen trailing behind me. Some parts I unwrapped when I needed to, but most of it stayed, a constant reminder of what I'd become. My strength was inhuman now. I could tear steel doors from their hinges, bend metal bars with my bare hands, punch through concrete walls, but my coordination was gone, replaced by jerky movements that felt like I was controlling a puppet from outside my own body. Every action required conscious thought. Pick up this object, move this foot, turn this way. Things that used to be automatic now demanded my full attention. I shambled when I tried to walk, lurched when I tried to run. My body no longer responded to instinct, only to deliberate command. The hunger started on day 3, not for food, but for something else. Warmth, life force, maybe just the memory of what it felt like to be alive instead of this preserved mockery. It gnawed at me constantly, a desperate need I couldn't satisfy. When I found the food stores, the pre-war meals in their sealed containers, I couldn't taste them. The act of eating was mechanical, forcing matter into a digestive system that barely functioned. But the hunger remained, unsatisfied, growing stronger with each passing day. If you're still with me after hearing this, hit that like and subscribe button, because what I'm about to tell you next gets even worse. Other mummified ones were waking up too. I could hear them in the deeper chambers, moaning in voices that sounded like they were coming from dried out throats, speaking languages that hadn't been used in millennia. The sound echoed through the salt mine tunnels, bouncing off ancient rock walls until it became a chorus of the damned. Sometimes I could make out words, but they weren't English. They weren't any modern language at all. It was as if the preservation process, the FEV, the radiation exposure, had awakened something buried deep in our genetic code. Somehow the FEV and preservation process had activated genetic memories, ancestral knowledge buried in our DNA. The scientists had theorized this might happen. I found the files later. They knew that FEV could unlock latent genetic information, force expression of dormant traits. Combined with the preservation compounds and the Egyptian psychological conditioning, some subjects now believed they actually were ancient Egyptian priests, speaking in tongues, performing rituals with salvaged equipment. I watched one of them in the ritual chamber, a woman who'd been a stockbroker before the war, now moving through elaborate ceremonies with hand gestures she couldn't possibly have learned. She chanted in what sounded like ancient Egyptian, her voice resonating with absolute conviction. The vault's PAW system crackled to life occasionally, playing pre-recorded messages from Vault-Tec executives about Phase 2 implementation and subject integration protocols. The recordings were scratchy, degraded by time, but still audible. A cheerful male voice would announce that subjects were progressing according to plan, that data collection was proceeding nominally, that the experiment was a success. Then, the system would cut out, leaving us in silence again. Sometimes I wondered if anyone was actually listening on the other end, monitoring our transformation. But the comm systems had been dead for decades. We were alone down here with our nightmares. I found a holotape dated 2078, recorded by the last surviving Vault staff member. Her voice was steady at first, clinical and professional. Subject 0321 showed first signs of mutation on day 47, she narrated. Muscle mass increased by 30%, skin pigmentation altered to gray-green hue, cognitive function remained within normal parameters. She'd watched the first subjects wake up, watched them tear through the facility when they realized what had been done to them. The recording degraded as it went on, her voice becoming more desperate, more frightened. By the end, she was whispering into the recorder, hiding somewhere in the maintenance tunnels. "They're not supposed to be awake yet," she said. "The timeline is wrong. Something's activating them early." Then, screaming in the background, the sound of tearing metal, and the recording ended. This wasn't a failed experiment. This was the experiment. I found the proof in the classified files, buried deep in the overseer's terminal under layers of encryption. Vault-Tec had known this would happen. They'd planned it from the beginning. The goal was to create a new form of super mutant that retained intelligence, but gained the radiation resistance of ghouls and the cultural conditioning of ancient preservation. They wanted soldiers who believed themselves to be reincarnated pharaohs, generals of ancient armies, priests of forgotten gods, warriors who would fight with the strength of super mutants but the tactical thinking of trained humans, all wrapped in radioactive linen and sealed in golden sarcophagi until needed. The documents laid it out in excruciating detail. Phase 1 was preservation and transformation, exposing subjects to controlled doses of FEV-laced compounds while maintaining them in cryogenic stasis. Phase 2 was psychological conditioning through environmental design and subliminal messaging. The hieroglyphic warnings weren't just decoration, they were instructions embedded in our subconscious during the preservation process. Phase 3 was controlled awakening and deployment. We were supposed to be activated remotely, released in strategic locations to secure territory for Vault-Tec's post-war operations. We were weapons, not survivors, tools, not people. The corporate memos were even more chilling. Cost-benefit analyses comparing the Mummified Ones to traditional super mutant production methods, efficiency reports on preservation compound ratios, marketing proposals for selling the technology to military contractors. One memo discussed potential applications for long-term space exploration, preserving crew members for century-long voyages to distant planets. They saw us as products, patents, profit margins. The human cost never entered the equation. 500 people paid to be test subjects in an experiment designed to destroy their humanity. When I finally breached the vault door, tearing it open with strength I didn't understand, I found the Nevada wasteland had changed in ways I couldn't have predicted. The salt flats outside were transformed into a bizarre landscape of crystal formations, the residual radiation combining with mineral deposits to create structures that glowed faintly in the darkness. Raiders had built encampments among the crystalline growths, using them as shelter and defenses. But what shocked me most was their decoration. Every raider gang wore pre-war Egyptian artifacts, painted pyramids on their leather armor, worshipped golden idols scavenged from museums. They called us the Tomb Lords when they saw us emerging. Towering figures wrapped in glowing linen, wearing pre-war power armor components we'd scavenged from the vault's storage. We carried weapons that mixed laser rifles with ceremonial staffs, creating bizarre hybrid tools of destruction. The raiders didn't attack at first. They fell to their knees, babbling prayers to gods they didn't understand. Some of them had clearly been down in the vault before, scavenging the outer chambers. They'd seen the golden sarcophagi, the hieroglyphic halls, and created their own cargo cult around what they found. To them, we were living gods emerging from sacred tombs. I tried to communicate with them to explain that we weren't divine, just victims of an experiment. But when I spoke, my voice came out wrong, hollow and resonant, like it was echoing from the bottom of a well. The wrappings over my mouth distorted the sound, and the FEV mutations had changed my vocal cords. What came out sounded like ancient incantations, even to my own ears. The raiders prostrated themselves further, offering tributes of scavenged tech and preserved food. They wanted blessings, guidance, divine intervention. I gave them directions to the nearest settlement and fled into the wasteland. Some of the mummified ones had gone completely feral, lost to the degradation of consciousness that came with the mutation. I encountered them in the outer tunnels, attacking anything living, driven only by the hunger and the ancient programming buried in the compound Osiris. They moved with terrifying speed despite their shambling gait, using tactics that seemed to come from nowhere. Flanking maneuvers, coordinated attacks, strategic withdrawals. The military conditioning was still there, buried under layers of madness. Fighting them was like fighting trained soldiers who'd forgotten why they were fighting but retained all their lethal skills. I led a group of the stable ones, those who could still remember being human, into the wasteland. There were maybe 20 of us, individuals who'd managed to hold on to their identities despite the transformation. We recognized each other by the designation numbers on our sarcophagi, called each other by our protocols since our real names were lost. Protocol Kepri, that was me. Protocol Anubis was a former lawyer who now stood 7 feet tall and could see in complete darkness. Protocol Thoth was a teacher who developed the ability to process information at superhuman speeds, her mind racing through calculations and strategies faster than any computer. We searched for other vaults, for answers, for any way to reverse what Vault-Tec had done to us. The wasteland was more hostile than we'd imagined, 200 years of mutation and evolution creating threats we weren't prepared for. Rad scorpions the size of cars, death claws that hunted in packs, mutants from other experiments who saw us as competition. But we had advantages. We didn't need to eat much. The preservation compounds keeping our bodies functioning on minimal input. Radiation healed us instead of harming us, the same mutations that created us making us immune to the wasteland's greatest threat. We were built for this world, even if we hated what we'd become. We found records eventually, scattered across military installations and abandoned Vault-Tec facilities. Vault-Tec had built 12 preservation vaults across America, each testing different mummification techniques combined with FEV variants. Ours was designated Vault 88, the Pharaoh Protocol. Vault 43 tested Norse preservation methods, creating Draugr soldiers who believed they were ancient Vikings. Vault 76 experimented with Aztec techniques, producing warriors who thought they were resurrected Jaguar Knights. Each vault was a cultural experiment combined with biological warfare research. We were the only one that had successfully produced viable subjects. The other preservation vaults had failed in various ways. Some had total system failures, the preservation compounds degrading before subjects could transform. Others had transformation rates that were too high, every subject going feral immediately upon awakening. One vault's FEV strain had been too aggressive, dissolving subjects from the inside out while they were still in stasis. The files showed images of burst sarcophagi filled with liquefied remains, biological horror shows that made our condition look merciful by comparison. The success of our vault made us valuable. We discovered that various wasteland factions knew about us, had been searching for Vault 88 for decades. The Brotherhood of Steel wanted to study us, possibly dissect us to understand the preservation technology. The Enclave remnants saw us as either weapons to be controlled or threats to be eliminated. The Institute had intercepted our vault's research data and incorporated elements of it into their own FEV experiments. We were walking repositories of pre-war technology that everyone wanted to possess or destroy. We tried to establish a settlement at first, finding an abandoned pre-war facility that could house us, but the other mummified ones kept coming, drawn by some instinct we didn't understand. The feral ones would attack our defenses, trying to break in. The semi-lucid ones would arrive claiming divine mandates, insisting they were pharaohs who deserved to rule. The psychological conditioning ran too deep in some of them. They couldn't separate their false memories from reality, genuinely believing they were ancient rulers reborn into a new world. Arguments became fights, fights became battles, and eventually we had to abandon the settlement before we destroyed each other. I discovered something worse in the deepest levels of Vault 88, chambers we hadn't explored in our initial escape. There were more sarcophagi down there, hundreds of them, arranged in vast halls carved from the salt rock. But these ones were different, smaller, child-sized. The designation plates read, Juvenile Protocols, subjects ranging from age 5 to 15. Vault-Tec had experimented on children, preserving them with the same techniques, exposing them to the same compounds. Most hadn't survived. The small golden tombs contained tiny mummified corpses, children frozen in death, their preservation perfect but lifeless. A few had survived, awakened, transformed. I found evidence of their escape in the tunnels, small footprints in the salt dust, handprints at child height on the walls. They'd fled deeper into the mine system, into natural caves that extended for miles beneath the vault. I tried to follow, to find them, to help them, but the tunnels were a maze, branching and connecting in patterns that defied mapping. I could hear them sometimes, singing in the darkness, children's voices echoing through stone, songs in languages that predated civilization, melodies that made my skin crawl. Whatever they'd become down there in the dark, they weren't children anymore. The psychological toll of what we'd become was worse than the physical transformation. I watched Protocol Anubis break down one night, screaming that he couldn't remember his daughter's face. He knew he had a daughter. The memory was there, but her features had blurred into nothing. The preservation process had stolen our past, even as it gave us this twisted immortality. We were losing ourselves piece by piece, our humanity eroding under the weight of false memories and altered genetics. Some nights, I would try to remember my life before, but it felt like remembering someone else's story, a tale told secondhand about a person who no longer existed. The hunger never stopped. It changed over time, evolved, became more specific. We realized we were feeding on something intangible, some quality that living things possessed. When we were near humans, really near them, close enough to hear their heartbeats and smell their sweat, the hunger would quiet temporarily. Not satisfied, but muted. We weren't vampires. We didn't need blood. We needed life itself, proximity to it, immersion in it. It was as if the preservation process had cut us off from some fundamental connection to living things, and we were desperately trying to bridge that gap through closeness. The Wastelanders learned to fear us, spreading stories about the Mummified Ones. We became legends, myths, cautionary tales told around campfires. They said we could curse people with a touch, that our wrappings carried diseases from before the war, that looking into our eyes would drive you mad. None of it was true, but the fear was real. Settlements would evacuate when they heard we were approaching. Trade caravans would take long detours to avoid our known routes. We became pariahs in a world that already had too many monsters. This story has kept you listening this far, and you want more of these dark confessions from the wasteland. Hit that like button. It really motivates me to create similar Fallout lores. Some of us tried to end it. Protocol Hathor walked into the Hoover Dam's intake turbines, letting the machinery tear her apart, but the preservation compounds had made us incredibly durable. She survived, mangled and broken, dragging herself out of the water with shattered limbs that slowly regenerated. Protocol Set climbed to the top of a pre-war skyscraper and jumped, splattering across the pavement below. 3 days later, he was walking again, bones reset, organs reformed. We couldn't die easily. The same technology that had transformed us made us nearly indestructible. Suicide became just another form of torture, temporary oblivion followed by inevitable resurrection. We adapted because we had no choice. The Mummified Ones who retained their sanity formed a loose network, maintaining contact through pre-war radio equipment we'd salvaged and modified. We established protocols for avoiding each other's territories, preventing conflicts that could draw attention. We shared information about vault locations, Vault-Tec facilities, anywhere that might contain clues about reversing our condition or at least understanding it better. The communication was sparse, crackling through the wasteland's interference, but it was enough to remind us we weren't completely alone. Protocol Sobek discovered something crucial while exploring a collapsed Vault-Tec research facility in the Mojave. The scientist had kept detailed notes on every stage of the preservation vault experiments, including theoretical reversal procedures. The documents described a compound they called Compound Horus, designed as an antidote to Osiris. It would theoretically break down the FeV modifications, purge the preservation chemicals from our tissues, restore our cellular structure to something resembling normal. But the formula was incomplete. The researchers had been working on it when the bombs fell, and their work was scattered across multiple facilities that no longer existed. I volunteered to search for the missing components. It gave me purpose, something beyond just surviving day to day in this mummified existence. I traveled across the wasteland, following leads from old files, chasing rumors of pre-war laboratories that might still have intact research data. Each location was a gamble. Some facilities were completely destroyed, reduced to radioactive craters. Others had been claimed by raiders, super mutants, or worse. But occasionally, I'd find something useful, a fragment of the research, a piece of the puzzle. The journey took me to places I never imagined I'd see. The Glow in California, where Vault-Tec's original FEV research had been conducted. The ruins were still intensely radioactive, but that didn't affect me anymore. I walked through corridors that would kill an unprotected human in minutes, searching through corroded filing cabinets and shattered computer terminals. I found references to the Pan-Immunity Virion Project, the predecessor to FEV. The documents explained how the virus was designed to force evolutionary changes to make humans adaptable to any environment. Our transformation wasn't an accident or a malfunction. It was the virus working exactly as intended, just in ways the original designers never anticipated. I encountered other experiments in my travels, Vault-12's ghouls, who looked at me with a mixture of recognition and revulsion. We were cousins of a sort, both transformed by radiation and pre-war science, but where they'd retained mostly human forms, I'd become something else entirely. The ghoul settlement of Necropolis treated me with wary respect, offering supplies and information in exchange for my leaving quickly. They'd heard stories about the Tomb Lords, didn't want trouble. I couldn't blame them. Every time I saw my reflection in still water or broken glass, I understood their fear. The Institute's ruins in the Commonwealth held more pieces of the puzzle. Their scientists had been obsessed with FEV research, conducting their own experiments on wasteland subjects. I found laboratories where they'd tried to replicate Compound Osiris, creating their own preservation serums. The results were stored in cryogenic tanks, malformed things that were neither human nor super mutant. Some were still alive, or whatever you'd call their state. They looked at me through the frosted glass with eyes that held too much awareness, pleading silently for release or death. I destroyed the tanks, let them dissolve into nothing. It was the only mercy I could offer. During my search, I discovered we weren't the first attempt at this type of experiment. Vault-Tec had been testing preservation technologies since the 2050s, decades before Project Safehouse officially began. I found references to something called the Lazarus Initiative, early experiments combining cryogenics with chemical preservation. The subjects from those tests were all dead, the technology too primitive to actually work. But the failures had taught Vault-Tec valuable lessons, refined their techniques, led eventually to Compound Osiris and the preservation vaults. We were standing on a foundation of corpses, the end result of 50 years of human experimentation. What drove me forward through all of this was the memory of who I used to be. I couldn't remember my face clearly anymore, couldn't recall my own voice as it had sounded before. But I remembered feelings, emotions, the sense of being fully alive. I remembered sunlight feeling warm instead of just registering as temperature change. I remembered food having flavor, music creating emotional responses, human touch bringing comfort instead of just feeding the hunger. Those memories were fading, becoming abstract concepts rather than lived experiences, but they were enough to keep me searching. I met a wastelander named Marcus in a settlement built into an old shopping mall. He was a caravan guard, seen enough of the world to not immediately run when I approached. We talked, or tried to. My voice still sounded wrong, hollow and echoing, But he was patient. He told me about the world I'd missed, 200 years of history condensed into campfire stories, the rise and fall of the new California Republic, the Brotherhood of Steel's various chapters, the Institute's reign of terror in the Commonwealth. I told him about the world before, the one I barely remembered. We formed an unlikely friendship, meeting occasionally when his caravan routes brought him near my current location. Marcus asked me once if I regretted signing up for the Vault. I had to think about it, really consider it. If I'd known what would happen, would I have made a different choice? But the alternative was dying in the nuclear fire with everyone else, or surviving as a regular ghoul if I was lucky, a pile of ash if I wasn't. At least this way, I was still conscious, still capable of thought and action. I was a monster, yes, but a thinking monster. A prisoner in a body that wasn't mine, but still aware enough to hate the cage. I told him I didn't know, that some questions don't have good answers. He accepted that, didn't push for more. The first real breakthrough came in a Vault-Tec executive bunker hidden beneath the ruins of Las Vegas. The facility had been built for senior company officials, a private shelter separate from the public vault system. Inside, I found personal computers belonging to the scientist who designed the preservation vaults. Their private files were more honest than the official reports, documenting the true goals of the experiments. One researcher had written extensively about the ethical implications, wrestling with what they were doing. She knew it was monstrous, knew they were creating abominations, but she'd convinced herself it was necessary, that advancing human survival capabilities justified any cost. Her final entries were written on the day the bombs fell. She'd made it to the bunker but couldn't get the door to seal properly. Radiation was seeping in, and she knew she was dying. In those last hours, she'd compiled everything she knew about Compound Horus, the theoretical reversal agent. The formula was there, complete and detailed, but so was the warning. The compound would work, would break down the IFEV modifications and purge the preservation chemicals. But there was no guarantee what would remain afterward. Our bodies had been in this state for decades, centuries for some of us. The cellular damage from reverting might be catastrophic. We might dissolve like the failed Institute experiments, or simply die as our altered biology collapsed without the modifications holding it together. I transmitted the formula to the other Mummified Ones through our radio network. The response was mixed. Some wanted to, try it immediately, willing to risk death for a chance at being human again. Others were afraid, having adapted to their new existence enough that the unknown seemed worse than the familiar horror. Protocol Thoth spent weeks analyzing the data, running calculations on salvaged computers, trying to predict outcomes. Her conclusion was grim, approximately 60% chance of survival, assuming we could synthesize the compound correctly, 40% chance of catastrophic cellular collapse and death. No way to know which outcome until we tried. We debated for months through crackling radio transmissions. Should we attempt the reversal? Did we have the right to risk the lives we'd built, monstrous as they were, for a chance at humanity we might not even achieve? Protocol Anubis argued we had a duty to try, that living as monsters was worse than dying as humans. Protocol Hathor countered that we'd already tried dying, that it didn't work, that we'd just be inflicting more suffering on ourselves. I listened to both sides, unable to decide where I stood. The decision was made for us when Protocol Set found a functioning Vault-Tec laboratory in the Capital Wasteland, complete with chemical synthesis equipment and a stock of preserved compounds. He could make Compound Horus, he transmitted. The lab was intact, the equipment functional. Anyone who wanted to try the reversal could come to his location. It was an invitation and a challenge, a chance to reclaim our humanity or die trying. I packed what little I owned and started walking east. The journey across the wasteland took months. I avoided settlements when possible, traveled at night to minimize contact with wastelanders. The rumors about tomb lords had spread, and there were bounty hunters who specialized in hunting creatures like me. Not for the money, though some settlements did offer rewards. for the glory, the bragging rights of taking down a pre-war monster. I had to fight my way through several ambushes, leaving broken bodies and shattered weapons in my wake. The guilt was crushing. These were people just trying to survive, seeing me as a threat. They weren't wrong. I reached Protocol Set's location in what used to be Washington, D.C., now a crater surrounded by radioactive ruins. The laboratory was deep underground, accessed through tunnels that had survived the bombardment. Set had gathered the necessary compounds, prepared the synthesis equipment. 4 other Mummified Ones had arrived before me. Protocol Anubis, determined to try. Protocol Bastet, hoping to remember her children's faces clearly again. Protocol Aten, who'd gone partially feral and was having lucid moments less frequently. Protocol Wadjet, the youngest of us, preserved at age 19 and desperate for a second chance at life. We stood in that laboratory, looking at the vials of compound Horus that Set had synthesized, clear liquid that glowed faintly green under the fluorescent lights. Each dose represented either salvation or death, no way to know which until it entered our bodies. Protocol. Anubis volunteered to go first, his determination overcoming his fear. Set administered the injection, pushing the compound directly into Anubis's chest where his heart still beat with irregular rhythm. The transformation was immediate and horrifying. Anubis screamed, a sound that started human and became something else as his body began to change. The wrappings fell away, dissolving as the compound broke down the preservation chemicals. Beneath them, his skin was bubbling, shifting, trying to revert to human form. For a moment, just a moment, I could see what he used to look like. A middle-aged man with kind eyes and graying hair. Then the cellular collapse began. His flesh turned translucent, internal structures visible through skin that was breaking down at the molecular level. He was dissolving, liquefying, his body unable to maintain cohesion without the EEV modifications holding it together. He lasted maybe 3 minutes before he was gone, reduced to a pool of organic matter that steamed and hissed as it broke down further. The smell was indescribable, every awful scent of death and decay compressed into one overwhelming assault on the senses. We stood there in silence, staring at what remained of Protocol Anubis. He'd died trying to be human again. Whether that was better or worse than continuing as a monster, I still couldn't say. Protocol Bastet stepped forward next. She'd made her choice, accepted the risk. Set administered the injection with shaking hands. Her transformation was different. The wrappings dissolved, the skin beneath bubbled and shifted, but instead of collapsing, her body stabilized. The gray-green hue faded to something closer to normal human coloring. The leathery texture smoothed out. She was changing, reverting, becoming human again. For 30 seconds, I thought she'd made it, that she was the lucky one who would survive the process. Then her heart stopped, just stopped. No warning, no gradual failure. The organ that had been modified by Fev to function under impossible conditions couldn't adapt back to normal parameters. It seized up, stopped pumping, and she collapsed. Protocol. Set tried to revive her, chest compressions, makeshift defibrillation using modified electrical equipment. Nothing worked. She died looking almost human, so close to salvation that her failure was somehow worse than Anubis's dissolution. The rest of us backed away from the remaining vials. 2 attempts, 2 deaths. The 60% survival estimate had been optimistic. Protocol Aten grabbed one of the vials before anyone could stop him, injected himself in a moment of desperate lucidity. His transformation was the worst yet. The feral modifications resisted the compound, creating a conflict within his cellular structure. He tore himself apart from the inside, blood vessels rupturing, organs failing in sequence. We had to restrain him to keep him from attacking us in his death throes. When he finally stopped moving, his body was unrecognizable, a mass of ruptured tissue that bore no resemblance to anything human. Protocol. Wadjet and I looked at each other, then at the remaining doses. 3 deaths, 3 different ways the reversal could fail. Set, was cataloging everything, taking samples, trying to understand why the compound wasn't working as designed. But I knew the truth. We'd been in this state too long, changed too completely. The human we used to be was gone, had been gone for decades or centuries. There was no going back because there was nothing to go back to. We were mummified ones now, would be until something finally destroyed us permanently. Protocol Wadjet made her decision. She picked up one of the remaining vials, held it up to the light, watching the green liquid swirl inside the glass. She was crying, I realized, tears running down leathery cheeks, leaving trails through the dust that covered her face. She'd been 19 when they sealed her in that golden tomb, a college student with her whole life ahead of her. 200 years later, she was a monster who couldn't remember what her parents looked like. The vial trembled in her hand. "Don't," I said, my hollow voice echoing through the laboratory. "We've seen what happens. 3 deaths, 3 different failures. The odds aren't in your favor." She looked at me with eyes that glowed faintly in the dim light, another side effect of our transformation. "What's the alternative? Keep existing like this? I can feel myself slipping, Kepri. Every day I remember less. Every day the false memories get stronger. Yesterday, I spent an hour convinced I was actually a priestess of Isis, that my whole pre-war life was a dream. How long before I go completely feral like Aten? How long before I forget I was ever human at all?" I had no answer for that because she was right. We were all sliding toward the same fate, losing ourselves piece by piece to the modifications Vault-Tec had forced upon us. Protocol Set had theorized that the psychological conditioning buried in Compound Osiris was programmed to activate over time, gradually replacing our real memories with the false ones. Eventually, we'd all believe we were ancient Egyptian nobility, reborn into the wasteland. The hunger, the mutations, the degradation of consciousness, it was all part of the design. Vault-Tec had wanted soldiers who thought they were gods. They were getting exactly that, just slower than planned. Wadjet injected herself before I could say anything else. The compound flowed into her veins, and immediately her body began to react. The wrappings dissolved as expected, falling away in strips of disintegrating fabric. Her skin bubbled and shifted, the gray-green hue fighting to return to something human. But unlike the others, she didn't scream. She gritted her teeth against the pain, watching her own transformation with desperate hope in her glowing eyes. Her skin smoothed out, color returning. The leathery texture faded. Her hair, which had become brittle and sparse, grew back thick and dark. For a full minute, she was changing successfully, reverting to human form. Set was frantically taking readings, monitoring her vital signs with salvaged medical equipment. Heart rate stabilizing, he reported. Cellular cohesion maintaining. Tissue regeneration within normal parameters. She was making it. Against all odds, Protocol Wadjet was actually surviving the reversal. Then, her brain started to swell. We could see it happening, her skull visibly expanding as the tissue inside grew beyond its normal bounds. The Ephive had modified her neural structure, increasing brain mass and processing capability. The reversal compound was trying to undo those changes, but the brain tissue was regenerating faster than it was breaking down. Too much matter in too small a space. She grabbed her head, finally screaming as pressure built inside her skull. Blood ran from her nose, her ears, her eyes. Protocol Set tried to intervene, pulling out a surgical kit, talking about relieving the pressure. But before he could do anything, Wadjet collapsed. The swelling stopped, her body going completely still. Set checked her vital signs, worked frantically to find a pulse, any sign of life. Nothing. Her brain had hemorrhaged, blood vessels rupturing under the pressure. She died with her body almost completely human again, skin smooth and hair restored, looking more like the 19-year-old college student she'd been than the monster she'd become. So close to salvation, and yet another failure. I looked at the remaining vials of Compound Horus. 4 doses left, 4 chances to either die or achieve something worse than death. Set was already preparing his notes, documenting the failures, theorizing about modifications to the formula. But I knew the truth. There was no formula that could undo what we'd become. The mummified ones were permanent, an irreversible condition created by centuries of exposure to modified phoebe and preservation compounds. We were locked in these bodies, trapped in this existence, for however long we could maintain our sanity. "We need to destroy it," I said, pointing at the remaining doses. "All of it. The formula, the synthesis equipment, everything. This isn't salvation, it's just another way to die." Set looked at me with something like betrayal in his eyes. "4 failures don't mean the process is impossible. We need more data, more test subjects. If we can refine the compound, adjust the dosage, account for the neural expansion, more test subjects." I cut him off. "You mean more mummified ones dying in front of us? How many deaths will it take before you accept that we can't go back?" He didn't answer, just turned back to his equipment, already working on formulating modifications. I realized then that Set had gone too far down this path to turn back. The research had become his purpose, his reason for existing. Without it, he'd have to face the reality of what we were, what we'd always be. The work let him pretend there was hope, that salvation was just one more iteration away. I couldn't take that from him, even if it was a lie. I left the laboratory, climbing back up through the tunnels to the surface. The capital wasteland stretched out before me, a devastated landscape of broken buildings and radioactive craters. Somewhere out there were the other mummified ones, some still clinging to their humanity, others sliding into the false memories and feral behavior. We were scattered across the continent, isolated by our nature, united only by our shared curse. The wasteland had adapted to our presence over the years. Raiders incorporated Egyptian imagery into their culture because of us, creating a bizarre fusion of post-apocalyptic survival and ancient mythology. Some settlements worshipped us as gods, building shrines and offering tributes. Others hunted us as demons, organizing expeditions to destroy the Tomb Lords. We'd become part of the wasteland's mythology, creatures as iconic as Deathclaws or super mutants. Future generations would tell stories about us, probably not understanding that we were just victims of another Vault-Tec experiment. I thought about Marcus, the caravan guard who'd befriended me despite my appearance. He was probably dead by now. Humans didn't last long in the wasteland, and it had been years since our last meeting. But the memory of our conversation stayed with me, reminding me that connection was still possible even in this form. Not friendship exactly, not with the fundamental gap between what I was and what he'd been, but something close to it, moments of genuine communication across the barrier of my transformation. The hunger gnawed at me constantly now, a background sensation I'd learned to ignore. Being near the dying test subjects had quieted it temporarily, their life force or whatever I was feeding on providing brief relief, but it always returned, an emptiness that couldn't be filled. Some mummified ones had given into it completely, establishing themselves in populated areas and feeding the need through constant proximity to humans. They became local fixtures, mysterious figures who haunted the edges of settlements, never quite leaving but never fully arriving either. I couldn't do that, couldn't inflict my presence on people just to ease my own suffering. Instead, I wandered, moving through empty spaces where the hunger couldn't be satisfied, but also couldn't drive me to desperate acts. The loneliness was crushing sometimes, long stretches of isolation broken only by occasional radio contact with other mummified ones. But it was better than the alternative, better than becoming the monster that Vault-Tec had designed me to be. I discovered more preservation vaults in my wandering. Vault 43 in the Pacific Northwest, where the Norse protocol experiments had created their own version of the mummified ones. The Draugr, they called themselves, convinced they were ancient Viking warriors. They'd established a settlement in the ruins of Seattle, ruling over human thralls who actually believed the mythology. I tried to talk to their leader. Protocol Odin, he called himself, tried to explain what we really were. He attacked me, screaming about heresy and false prophets. I barely escaped, realizing that some of us had lost the battle against the conditioning completely. Vault 76 in Central America had its own horror story. The Aztec protocol had produced warriors who believed they needed human hearts to sustain themselves. Whether it was true or just another delusion born from the conditioning, they'd built a pyramid from salvaged materials and performed ritual sacrifices. The local settlements had banded together to destroy them, a rare moment of cooperation driven by pure survival instinct. I found the pyramid abandoned, its mummified inhabitants hunted down and killed by coordinated wasteland forces. Their bodies were scattered around the structure, finally granted the death they couldn't achieve on their own. The other preservation vaults told similar stories: failure, madness, violence. We were all variations on the same theme: cultural conditioning mixed with FEV modification and preservation technology. Vault-Tec had created 12 different flavors of monster, each one believing themselves to be something noble and ancient, each one slowly losing their humanity to false memories and biological imperatives. The experiment had succeeded beyond their wildest expectations, producing soldiers who thought they were gods. They just couldn't control what they'd created. I returned to Vault 88 eventually, drawn back to the place where it all began. The salt mine was exactly as I'd left it, golden sarcophagi still lined up in endless rows. Some had been opened by scavengers, the contents taken or destroyed. Others remained sealed, their occupants never waking, never knowing what they'd been spared. I walked through the halls, reading the hieroglyphic warnings that I could now understand perfectly. They weren't just decoration or psychological conditioning. They were actual instructions in ancient Egyptian, explaining the preservation process, the transformation, the expected outcomes. The children I'd heard singing in the deep tunnels were still down there. I could hear them occasionally, their voices echoing through the salt rock. I never found them, never saw them directly, but I'd leave food and supplies at tunnel intersections sometimes, and they'd always be gone when I returned. Whatever they'd become in the darkness, they were surviving, adapting to existence in ways I couldn't imagine. Maybe that was better than trying to live in the surface world, pretending to be something we weren't. Protocol Thoth contacted me one final time through the radio network. She'd finished her analysis of the compound Horus. Failures determined why the reversal hadn't worked. Our bodies had been in the transformed state for too long, she explained. EV modifications had become our baseline, the foundation upon which everything else was built. Removing them was like trying to remove a building's foundation while people were still living inside. The structure couldn't support itself without the modifications, couldn't maintain cohesion once they were stripped away. She'd also discovered something else in her research. The preservation compounds were slowly degrading, breaking down over decades and centuries. Eventually, probably within the next 100 years, they'd degrade completely. When that happened, we'd finally die. Not dramatically, not violently. We'd just stop, our bodies finally giving in to the entropy they'd been fighting since the day we were sealed in those golden tombs. It was the closest thing to hope I'd heard in years. An end, guaranteed, inevitable. We just had to survive long enough to reach it. If this confession meant something to you, leave a like. It's the only way I know you like the video. I spend my nights now in the upper chambers of Vault 88, looking out through the cracked vault door at the Nevada sky. The stars are clearer than they were before the war, less light pollution obscuring them. I try to remember what it felt like to look at stars and feel wonder instead of just registering their positions and luminosity. The emotion is gone, filed away with all the other human feelings I'm slowly losing. But the memory of having felt it remains, a ghost of sensation that reminds me I was once capable of more than just existing. Sometimes other mummified ones come through, passing by on their own wanderings. We share information, trade supplies, maintain the fragile network that keeps us from complete isolation. Protocol Bastet's body was recovered and cremated by Set, given what dignity we could manage. Protocol, Anubis, and Aten dissolved completely, leaving nothing to bury. Protocol Wadjet was preserved in one of the intact cryogenic pods, Set's way of honoring her near success. She looks peaceful in there, almost human again, frozen in the moment before her brain hemorrhaged. The raiders still worship us when they see us, still build their crude shrines and offer their tributes. I accept them sometimes, not because I need them, but because refusing would shatter their faith. They've built their entire culture around our existence, created meaning from our curse. Who am I to take that away from them? Let them believe we're gods. Let them find purpose in worshiping monsters. The wasteland needs myths to survive, and we're as good as any. I found my original sarcophagus eventually, the golden tomb marked with Subject 0847. Protocol Kepri. The lid was still cracked where I'd torn it open, the interior still lined with the remnants of my wrappings. I sometimes sleep in it, lying in the space where I spent 200 years transforming from human to monster. The padding is rotted, the systems are dead, but the shape still fits. It's the only place I feel like I belong, sealed in gold and darkness, preserved for a future that never came. This is my testimony, my confession, my warning. I was human once. I had a name I can't remember, a life I can barely recall, a future that was stolen and replaced with this immortal curse. Vault-Tec promised us salvation and delivered damnation. They turned us into weapons disguised as myths, monsters wrapped in the trappings of ancient divinity. We're the Mummified Ones, the Tomb Lords, the failed experiment that succeeded too well, and we're still out here in the wasteland, shambling through the ruins, wrapped in radioactive linen, searching for an end that won't come for another 100 years. When you see the golden tombs, when you find the vaults with Egyptian hieroglyphs on the walls, remember what was done here. Remember that every monster has a name they've forgotten, a life they've lost, a humanity that was taken from them. I don't know how much longer I can hold on to who I was. The false memories are getting stronger, more insistent. Some mornings I wake up convinced I'm actually an ancient pharaoh, that the vault and the bombs and the transformation were all just strange dreams. It takes hours to remember the truth, to piece together my real history from the manufactured mythology. Soon, maybe very soon, I won't be able to tell the difference anymore. When that happens, when I finally lose the last pieces of my humanity to the conditioning and the mutations, I hope someone will put me down. I hope there's a bounty hunter or a Brotherhood paladin or just a lucky wasteland survivor who'll put a bullet through my skull and end this existence. I've earned that much. We all have. Until then, I wander. I preserve this testimony in holotapes scattered across the wasteland, hoping someone will find them and understand. I maintain contact with the other mummified ones who are still fighting the degradation. I avoid the ones who've given in, the self-proclaimed gods and pharaohs who've embraced the lie. And I wait for the degradation protocol Thoth predicted, the slow breakdown that will finally grant us the death we can't achieve ourselves. The golden sarcophagus was supposed to keep me safe. Instead, it made me immortal in the worst possible way. I'm preserved, unchanging, eternal. But I'm not alive, not really. I'm a monument to Vault-Tec's cruelty, a walking testament to what happens when corporations treat human lives as experimental variables. I'm Subject 0847, Protocol Kepri, one of the Mummified Ones, and I'm still hungry.